I've had the privilege over the last number of years to host church planting in Sacramento, and you can see Kevin Adams and Eric Dirksen, both who are church planters, and there's Brandon. Some of you remember Brandon. And when church planters plant a church, one of the ways that they do it is they have a lot of conversations. I remember Eric in particular had a list of 4 questions, and he would go into coffee shops and try to see how many people he could talk to over a span of 6 months and ask those 4 questions and engage in conversation and see if he could learn more and more and more about what's going on in the minds and hearts of people around them. And it struck me as I reflected on that over the last 3 years via YouTube and the internet, I've had hundreds of conversations with people all over the world from a whole variety of backgrounds, all about what they think about. Some are doubters. I've had 304 conversations on the list that I have on YouTube, and that's only the conversations that were appropriate and agreed upon to place on the internet. Some of those 304 are doubles. Some are not posted. But across the board, there are atheists, Christians, spiritual but not religious, skeptical, some of them feeling their faith slipping away, others sort of finding faith and coming to Christian belief or belief in not quite what they know about, and a lot of people who are sort of curious about God. Because over the Christmas break, I usually try to take at least a little bit of time off. Last Tuesday, myself and some of my kids hopped in the truck, and Yosemite Park is open again, and it's one of my favorite places around, so quick day trip back and forth to Yosemite. It's a lot of driving, but I always feel it's well worth it. And I always take my camera and try and get a few pictures that are keepers. Well, why do I like to do that? What do I get from Yosemite? Psalm 19 says this: "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world." I often like going to Yosemite in the winter because if you go in summer, you're there with thousands of other people who make their way from all over the world to get to the park. But even in a Tuesday at the end of a year, there were hundreds of people, and you could just tell by looking around from all over the world that have made their way to that park, even though all you can really see in the winter all you can really get to is the valley. What is it about Yosemite? What is it about El Capitan or Half Dome or all those other places in the valley? The psalmist says a lot of interesting things here. Day after day they pour forth speech, but then he says they have no speech. They use no words. And they don't have a voice, but then he says their voice. And it gets at some of the strange experience that we have that we can't quite put into language. Somehow, whether people are from this background or that background, when they go into Yosemite Valley, they have a sense of awe. They have a sense of bigness. They have a sense of importance beyond themselves. And the psalmist says, Yosemite Valley, along with many other places in this world, talk about God. Now, I spend a lot of time on the internet talking to people who say God doesn't exist. And there's always a lot of discussion. Does God exist? Doesn't God exist? I haven't found that debate to be enormously fruitful in either direction. I don't find people either coming to faith or going away from faith so much based on does God or doesn't God exist. It has a lot more to do, I find, with what exactly are we talking about with respect to this little word that we use, God? People imagine that Christians believe, and some of them do, that God is a super thing up in the sky, sort of like one of us, but larger. But also all the ways that we are confined, that God would be confined. So he's sort of like a superhero or a super thing that lives in the sky who grants wishes and rewards you if you're nice. But the God of the Bible is quite different from the gods that the Bible refers to. Who are these other gods? And do they exist or don't they exist? And the Bible sort of plays games with that other level of the gods. But as Jewish and Christian scholars have noted, actually for centuries, that when the Bible talks about God, it's a little bit different than a superhero or Marduk or Zeus. The God of Israel was different. He was categorically different from the gods. The gods served him, the Elohim, which you can find in the Hebrew language, and we wrestle to know, are those angels? What exactly does the Hebrew Bible talk about with respect to the Elohim? But one of the ways that I've worked on this is God is in some ways arenic and agentic. What does that mean? The Apostle Paul says, in him we live and move and have our being. And God is in some ways likened to, as I would say, Tolkien to Middle Earth. If Frodo went all about Middle Earth, could he actually find Tolkien? If you were to go to Frodo and say, well, you can find actually Tolkien all over Middle Earth, but you can't lay your hands on Tolkien in Middle Earth because Tolkien to Middle Earth is a little bit different from Frodo to Sam. Now, people have an instinct about this that they often can't put into words. I have noted this many times, that often when people give up a well-formed, organized religion, what they really do is sort of slip into a less well-formed, more disorganized religion, and their language betrays the fact. One of my favorite examples of this is a commercial from a number of years ago from Verizon. And there's a woman that her name in the commercial was Lisa, so I call her Verizon Lisa. She's always talking to the universe. And it's like, why are you talking to the universe? Well, I don't believe in a God, so I'm going to relate to the universe. And you have to pause and say, that's a rather interesting thing to do. She's walking down and she sees a Verizon store and she says, the universe is telling me to buy a new smartphone. Well, that's interesting. And I think about Psalm 19. Well, something is telling you something, but it's a little bit vague. It's a little bit hard to understand. Now, Verizon Lisa is not completely wrong. The universe does pour forth speech, but it's a little confusing what's happening. Maybe she should buy a smartphone. Maybe she shouldn't buy a new smartphone. The universe apparently in this Verizon commercial also says Lisa's hair looks good that day, and she agreed. So there you go. Christian Smith, who's a sociologist in the 1990s, did an exhaustive survey of the intuitions of American teenagers with respect to religion and spirituality. And what he discovered is that even though he was interviewing children who were raised Baptist or Presbyterian or no church at all or Muslim or Mormon, across the religious spectrum, he noticed commonalities that emerged among them. And it was sort of this religion that's in the waters in our culture. He called it moralistic therapeutic deism. And there were 5 tenets that he distilled from listening to all of the patterns and commonalities between them. People almost universally believe that a God exists who created the world and orders the world and watches over life on earth. God wants people to be good, nice and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most other world religions. The central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. God is not involved in my life except when I need God to resolve a problem. Good people go to heaven when they die. They sort of leave it there. And usually when times get bad or someone pops onto the national zeitgeist who's been particularly mean or cruel or destructive, suddenly hell comes out reserved for just the really bad people, or maybe the really bad people in my life or in the lives that I've loved, the loved ones that I've loved. And you can notice that there are some commonalities with Christianity and many of these many other religions in this moralistic therapeutic deism, but if you expose this to a little bit of critique, you find that things get squishy very quickly. And then, of course, comes 2020. And many of us have lived in a country with remarkably good politics, at least as compared to the rest of the world. Remarkably good economics, at least compared to the rest of the world. Remarkably good health care, at least compared with the rest of the world. And I say these things, and if you've only lived in this country, well, you have a sense of, well, there's good and there's bad, and government isn't always good, and it's not always bad, and a lot of things can happen, but go and live in a place like David and Christy are living, and you'll get a lesson into, wow, it's sort of nice when the electricity's on all the time. And if you call 911, someone with at least a degree of competence is likely to show in a reasonable amount of time. And, well, the government might not function perfectly, but compared to government functioning in many other places of the world. And you might be concerned about election corruption, and there is always a degree of corruption, but how pervasive is it? And so we deal with all those things. And 2020 comes along, and here we have a pandemic. And at first we imagine, well, no one expected we would have a pandemic, but then you listen carefully and say, oh yeah, they've actually been talking about this for a number of years, and say, if not, but rather when, and when the when arrives, what then do you think about the universe, as you called it? When, even though sometimes things seem to go fairly well, how about when even though good people, or at least people who are good in your estimation, have bad and horrible things happen to them? What are we to think about that? When the world doesn't seem to be following the arc of justice or landing enough on the right side of history, what do you think about that? Now we're sort of celebrating the passing of 2020, but most of us know full well that, hey, it's January 3, 2021, and everyone sitting out in front of me is still wearing a mask. Reality doesn't really follow the numbers on the calendar that closely. Many of the atheists I talk to resolve the tension by saying, but there is no purpose to the world. All it is chance and chaos and fortune. So now you don't have to be worried about what a God thinks of you. Okay, but then you're just living in a world of chance and chaos and fortune, and you have no promise of what, in fact, the future might hold. What if 2021 is worse than 2020? It may be. We don't know. We have all this hopes in a vaccine. Will the vaccine work? Will they get it out? Many people are saying, well, actually, this virus is just the predecessor to more viruses, and this could come further. And I could sit here and talk about many other calamities that are potentially in our future. I'm not sure that the message that, well, everything is just purposeless chaos really offers a lot of comfort. We'll use reason to fix the world, but I'm not seeing that people are either much more rational or unrational with respect to what they were in 2019. It really doesn't address the issue. And so now I often talk to people who deconstructed, left religion, and they are now in the process of reconstructing, of trying to figure out how the world works. If the world is just a product of random chance and chaos, then how, in fact, have we been graced with all this goodness, beauty, and hope? How can you account for the good? That's actually the harder question. And so we're back in some ways in the great conversations of the world between Athens and Jerusalem, between philosophy and religion, and all of the argumentation. People are being drawn to the greatest conversations the world has ever hosted. Chaos makes sense, but how can we know order? How do we reason, and why does it work? How is it that we can both accomplish so much, yet be so weak? How this world can sustain goodness and beauty and love, and also be a place of devastating loss. The heavens may declare the glories of God. You can walk through Yosemite Valley in awe of the granite monoliths. But we need something more clear, which is in many ways why we speak. The Gospel of John begins with one of the most powerful and important and historical declarations of Christianity. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, if I say it like that in English, most of us think that's kind of a strange way to talk. In the beginning was the Word, and you'll notice in your English Bible, Word is a capital W. Well, what does it mean by that? Sometimes we put names in capital W's, sometimes we use pronouns with capital letters, but why would you put a capital W in front of Word? Well, the English editors of your modern Bibles are trying to clue you into the fact that what the Gospel of John was actually doing was engaging a very ancient conversation, one that had everything to do with Athens and Jerusalem. Because for centuries, the world had been wrestling with all of these big issues. This is a place of both astounding beauty and incredible suffering, where we on one hand have the capacity to create an RNA vaccine that is supposed to help alleviate us of this virus at a level that is so tiny none of us can see it, and yet it works. But still, with 13 million doses of the vaccine out into America, somehow we could only get 3 million of it into human arms. And so here we are with this human puzzle that how can we understand the world? And the Gospel of John begins by saying, let's start here. In the beginning, and right away we go back to Genesis, was the Word. And you're like, oh yeah, Genesis, he creates with a word. Well, what does that mean? And the Greeks would say hologos. Hologos, well, what is hologos? So then, if you're the scholarly type, you start to dig and you begin to ask questions. Well, what are words? What is this capacity we have to make language? We don't even think about it. It's so natural to us. And in fact, so then we study the history of words and we discover that Lego, which is the verbalized form of logos, actually means in very ancient ways to gather. And you think, what does speaking have to do with gathering? Well, it's actually quite simple, because at the end of a day, you sit down with those you're sharing your home with, or you're catching up on the phone, and what is the first question you have? How was your day? And what do you try to do? I summarize the day. Well, how do I summarize a day? If I were to ask each of you to sit down in this room and summarize this room, some of you would say it's a sanctuary. But notice what you're doing. You are borrowing on thousands of years of language and thinking and storytelling to come up with that one word. Because I could say, well, there was a metal music stand, and there was an iPad, and there was a cup, and there was a plate, and there was a screen, and there's this stuff that's plastic, but it looks like, it sort of looks like trees. Why would that be? And there's lights on it, and there's bells on it, and there's a soft, squishy stuff I'm walking on. Oh, I'm wearing shoes. I can do this longer than I live. What does language do? It takes a huge world and compresses it into what we all communally believe to be important. I went to the church building. Whoosh! A world is compressed and made clear and made intelligible by speech. In the beginning was the Word. You can walk into Yosemite Valley, and it has far more than what's in this room. But I just have to say El Capitan, and most of you have an image right in your head. And if you had ever visited there, you have an emotional reaction to when you first drove in that valley and saw that granite monolith. A word takes all of reality and focuses it for us. Well, why can't God just tell us? What would you like him to say? Would you believe him? Is it really just communication? Sit down and think about every relational conflict you've had. All the talking that goes back and forth. And what do we say? If only they would understand me. Or, if only I were heard. Look at what we're doing. It's all speech. Day after day, he pours forth speech. The Logos is God just telling us. How often doesn't Jesus say, those who have ears to hear, let them listen? What is he saying? He's saying that God has been speaking the whole time. Well, why can't we listen? Well, you know right now, this practice of talking and listening is a very complex thing. So the Greeks got into this, and they talked about this word, this logos. And over centuries, the Neoplatonists and the Platonists and the Stoics and Heraclitus and all of these philosophers talking about the Logos. The Logos meant two things. First, to the Greeks, we have a view that the use of logos for word or speech or utterance or revelation, not in the sense of something proclaimed of her or heard, but rather in that of something displayed, clarified, recognized, and understood. Logos as the rational power of calculation, in virtue of which man can see himself in the place in the cosmos. Logos as the indication of an existing or significant content which is assumed to be intelligible. Logos as the content itself, in terms of its meaning and law, its basis and structure, but then develops another trend in philosophy that John is bringing into his gospel and saying, there's another line of conversation that developed around this word. Secondly, we have in view logos as a metaphysical reality and an established term in philosophy and theology, from which there finally develops in later antiquity, under alien influences, a cosmological entity and hypostasis, a thing under a thing, of a deity, a deuterotheos. And you'd say, how could the Greeks think about all of that? And John comes in, quite likely in Ephesus, and says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. What in Middle-earth was not made by Tolkien? Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, knowledgeable people in the Hellenistic world would understand the philosophical subplot, but this revelation didn't require years of study in Greek philosophy. This revelation endured argumentation. Everyone talked about him. In fact, everyone has been talking about him for the rest of human history. Here, 2,000 years later, on a continent not even known by the people in Palestine at that time, we're still talking about him. He is more real than that which opposes him. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Imagine Tolkien showing up in The Lord of the Rings. People would look around and say, "Who is that old man smoking a pipe? He seems to know all the words of Gandalf and Frodo and Aragorn, but he's none of them. How on earth can he know everything about Middle-earth, yet not himself be defined by Middle-earth?" He came to that which his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, and I could spend just as long unpacking that statement, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, nor a husband's will, but born of God. And I could spend just as much time talking about that phrase. What does it mean to be born of God? We've talked about, well, Philip, Jared, and Ben are my sons, but in what way is Jesus the Son of God analogous to them being my sons, but not because it's different? And the idea that Jesus is God's Son and we can all become children of God, and how do those lines relate? The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And people could see something in Jesus. The centurion watching him crucified could say, surely this man was the Son of God. Did he know what he was saying? When you walk into Yosemite Valley and you see the glory, and you say, why do millions of people every year spend thousands and thousands of dollars to come to this one place to look at rock? Is there not rock in China and Japan and Germany and the UK and Modesto and kicking around in Sacramento? Why do they go? They can't tell you. There's something deep happening here. Out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. Grace compounding upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Last week we talked about norms and laws and this vision of the commons that you find in the book of Jeremiah, where the knowledge of the Lord will cover the peoples like the water covers the sea. Well, how can that happen? Verizon Lisa has a sense of it, but it's sort of confused. Buy a new iPhone. Your outfit looks nice today. Thank you. But it has to be more specific. It has to be more concrete. It has to gather everything down and make it clear right in front of us. Can the universe become a man? And not just the chaos of the universe, but the perfection that caused the universe. And if that could become a man, how would we relate to that? And in fact, if all of that could become, if the Logos could become a man, suddenly how I relate to the Logos has everything to do with how I relate to everything. No one has seen God, and in some ways everyone has sort of seen something of God. That's what Romans 1 says. That's what Psalm 19 says. But it's kind of confusing. For the law was given through Moses. Well, the law helps. Do this, don't do that. That's important. We need laws. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And there finally is a name. Because you'd say, well, Jesus was God, like there's a little God in all of us. Well, then that doesn't really help us because there's so many of us. And that same little bit of God is in the best person or the worst person. What you need is someone for whom the best is all right there. And it doesn't help that, well, there's a little bit of goodness in him and there's a little bit of goodness in her, because which goodness in him and which goodness in her? Just like, well, tell me about the room we're sitting in. Well, we call it the sanctuary. That tells you more than if I were to tell you the floor dimensions of this room, or the color of the carpet says a little bit more, or. We need something that the whole is brought into and refined in someone just like us. No one has seen God, but the one and only Son, who himself is God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. You might say, well, 2020 is roughly, give or take, 4 to 6 years probably, 2,000 years since he came on the scene, and we're still a mess. There's still darkness in the world. The world still resists him. We still imagine ourselves at the center of the story. And in some ways we are. We are sort of the center of our stories. This whole room is somehow funneled through my consciousness. And so I am a little center of it, but I am the center of my story. I'm not the center of the story. Well, how can there be a story that contains all of the world? We imagine ourselves at the center of the story, but the world continues to disappoint. I can't wield this world. I cannot say to COVID, be gone, and it is gone. I cannot bid the storm to cease or the dead to come to life. Why would John say such audacious things that are both so astoundingly philosophical, but yet so simple that people with almost no education can get a handle on it, if, in fact, such a man hadn't come? And John suggests we can continue to relate to him in ways more direct than we can relate to God by going to Yosemite Valley. One of the things that we learn, and we talked about this last week, that why do we break champagne over boats? It makes no sense unless you follow it all the way back. Only by voluntary sacrifice do we begin to see ourselves, begin to trust his goodness, begin to join in the cruciform pattern by which neighbors are loved, gifts are given, death is swallowed up in victory. Because we would imagine that, well, all of our suppositions about power and authority and governance mean that Jesus would come down in a chariot of fire and he would give a law and everyone would obey the law. But we'd seen that play out before. God came on a mountain and Moses gave a law and everybody said, we do it, and they didn't. We have a problem in our hearts deeper than that. And so what he comes to do this time is to say, I will be in your midst. We will see how much of me you can tolerate. And maybe after you do with me what you think you should, you will see a little bit more of yourself. Because the truth is, what he reveals to this world is what every mother knows. What every public servant knows, whatever every lover of another broken, sinful human being knows, that the path to life and redemption is costly. Everyone who has a child learns from that child what the meaning of selfishness is. Because they will say, that child is so selfish. That infant is the most selfish creature in all the world. She cries, she demands, I must get up in the middle of the night. That baby's comfort comes at my expense. Yes, and what do you learn as a new mother or a new father? I want my sleep more than that baby's comfort. But what you learn is that that baby will not live if you do not sacrifice for that child. And so you will sacrifice. You will give your time, you will give your money, you will give your attention. Your life will no longer be your own so that that child would live. That story comes to fruition in him who hangs on the cross and says to us, you only live by my sacrifice. And you show me by sacrificing to a world that doesn't understand. Just like, go talk to that newborn baby and say, you know, you're awfully inconsiderate to your parents. Tell that baby that. Use any language you'd like. Tomorrow night, that baby will cry all over again. Not just the baby, but the noisy neighbor, the dog, the decaying car that you drive. It's all the same. And so someone comes to say, this is the world as you have it. This is your life as you run it. But this is the world I want to give you. And this is how it's given. He shows us glory by giving himself. He shows his glory by giving, we show his glory by giving ourselves in grateful response. You say, well, I can't grab Jesus and show him to my neighbor. Well, actually you do. Well, how do I do it? You do it through you. You grab Jesus by being Jesus, and you show that to your neighbor. Well, what does that look like? It looks like it's always looked like. We become children of the Father just as he showed himself to be the Son of the Father. On the night he was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it. A grain of wheat goes into the ground to die, to yield more wheat. Christ the King comes and becomes a sacrifice for the world so that we can live. On the night he was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it and he said, "This is my body broken for you." Every time a mother soothes a crying infant, her life is broken in a tiny little way so that baby can live. Jesus comes and says, "I'm all of human history compacted into me." Right here at the heart of human history, the world can see the story up close. He says, "Take, eat, remember and believe." Now, if you're watching at home and you forgot that this was the first Sunday of the month and that we would be sharing communion together, you can pause the video. And by the miracles of electronics, I will sit paused right here. And you can run to the kitchen and you can get some bread and you can get some drinks. It can be grape juice, it can be a little bit of wine, it can be whatever you have on hand. And by the miracle of the video, I will be paused. But on the night that he was betrayed, he took bread and broke it and said, "This is my body given for you. whenever you eat this, remember me. He, of course, when he held up, tomorrow I'm going to post on my channel a conversation that I had with a new friend from the Discord server who is a Hasidic Jew. And when he reads the Gospels, he finds things and he says, what you're doing in that Lord's Supper with that cup, that comes from the Seder. All of that history comes right into there, and Jesus lifts up the cup and says, this is a new covenant in my blood. And we all sort of, well, why do we use wine? Well, it kind of looks red, it kind of looks deep red, or it kind of looks like blood. We're not drinking blood. Please, those of you following at home, do not drink blood. Grape juice, wine, a little bit of water, whatever you have. No blood, but it stands for blood. Because he says, this is a new covenant in my blood. This will be the last of blood sacrifice. I will conclude the innumerable thousands of years that human beings have been killing animals and each other for their own welfare. I voluntarily give up my blood so that no other blood need be shed. Take, drink, remember, and believe that the precious blood of Jesus was given for the complete forgiveness of all your sins. Should I do the blessing now, or?
We have a song, and then the blessing, and then the song.
Okay.
The song is Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence.